Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session on the NIS Directive, a coherent and consistent cybersecurity across the Union. It's a discussion that comes right on time as the Commission will soon publish its new legislative proposal, which will amend and change the current NIS regime. I'm Visiola Pula, Senior Analyst at Callan International, and I will be your moderator for today's session. I have the pleasure to be here this morning with Konstantinos Moulinos, Information Security Expert at ENISA, the EU Cybersecurity Agency, Paul Timmers, Senior Advisor at the European Policy Centre, Centre for Technology and Global Affairs at the University of Oxford, Professor Dr. Gabriele Lenzini, Head of the Interdisciplinary Research Group in Socio-Technical Cybersecurity at the University of Luxembourg, Tanya Wallace, Research Associate, School of Computing Science, University of Glasgow, and Dr. Richard Thomas, Industrial Fellow in Data Integration and Cybersecurity, School of Computer Science at the University of Birmingham. To our audience on the other side, we'd love to hear from you. Please do interact with us, do send us your questions, and together with the team from Forum Europe, we'll do our best to put forward some of them during the debate. And of course, for those of you who were not able to attend this morning, a recorded version will be available on the YouTube channel of Forum Europe. Just a little housekeeping before we get going. We're going to kickstart today's session with an ENISA representative and a few opening remarks from him. Then each of the speakers will follow with their own opening remarks. We will then be left towards the end of the discussion with a good couple of minutes to debate some of the points that the speakers have raised during their opening remarks, as well as the questions received. And I think we're ready to go, and I would already like to invite our first speaker for today, Konstantinos. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here to give you some elements relevant to the NIS Directive review. My name is Konstantinos Moulinos. I'm one of the key interfaces of ENISA with the NIS Cooperation Group. And I will start by giving you some highlights as per the NIS Directive status, I would say, where we are at the moment. As per the NIS Directive, all the member states have transposed the directive, and they have national cybersecurity strategies, different versions. Other member states have the first version, other have second, and so on and so forth. We're moving from the compliance to the implementation. Most of the member states have transposed the directive to national regulations, and now they are dealing with the implementation. This year we had the first annual summary report on incident notifications received. Soon this report is expected to be published. Commission has concluded its assessment report as per the consistency of operators of essential services, and also the cooperation group has agreed on its work program 2022. Some key findings that ENISA has observed during these 4 years of functioning of the NIS Directive. First of all, the overall assessment of ENISA, but also I think from the member states, is that overall the NIS Directive is a useful tool which has contributed to increase the level of cybersecurity across Europe. However, there are many difficulties, challenges that have to be fixed or overcome. Difficulties in assessing and monitoring, of course, and reviewing the national cybersecurity strategies, difficulties and challenges with different levels of maturity, the incident response capabilities domain from one sector to the other. Many member states have also included more sectors than those in Annex 2 of the directive. The identification process of operators of essential service is not based on harmonized approaches. Member states follow different approaches, different thresholds for identifying operators of essential services. We have different reporting thresholds. Also, another challenge is the coexistence of the NIS directive with other well-known horizontal or sectorial frameworks like GDPR, the Cybersecurity Act, the uh, PSD2, and so on and so forth for the finance. And this creates a lot of issues when it comes to overlapping or conflicting sometimes requirements. Another observation is that the NS directive is an element where the collaboration with the private sector is missing, and also that the existing version of the NS directive, there are no provisions for crisis management, and there is a need to collaborate, so to speak, with the blueprint of the European Commission. As per the identification process, we'll say Commission has identified that, as I said before, many the member states follow different approaches. This has resulted in some member states identifying a large number of operators. At the same time, other member states have identified a small number of operators, and this creates a negative impact on the level playing field in the internal market. Now, as per the NIS Directive review, the process has started this year, so to speak. In preparation of this review, Commission has published the assessment of operators of essential services identification processes report. Has also started visiting the member states and help and support the member states with the conformity checks of national legislation. Also, this year, the consultation started with a number of stakeholders in order to get feedback from the public and the private stakeholders as per the areas to be included in the NIS Directive review. And the results of this open public consultation have been published on the internet. And we expect, finally, the evaluation report of the NIS Directive and the impact assessment to be published soon. The expected date is the 16th of December, in 1 week, more or less. So the topics that have been identified during the discussions for the evaluation, you see in the slide, identification of operators of services. Shall we remain with the same approach? Do we have to enhance it? Do we have to eliminate it? This kind of questions arose during the consultations. The role of digital service providers. Digital service providers offer services normally to many member states, and this creates an issue as per the regime of the legislative regime of these operators. The scope, as I mentioned before, what a member state considers as essential is different from one member state to the other. The security requirements and how the different approaches that follow the member states. Some member states follow horizontal, other member states follow vertical approaches. Incident notification processes, what will be the thresholds? Should it remain the same? Should we add the parameters? Things like that were considered. Also, the relation between the national competent authorities and the CSIRTs and the CSIRT network, and ideas also for the improvement of functioning of the NIS cooperation group, and the cooperation and how to improve the cooperation at the European level. Issues like supply chain also was reason during the discussions. So next slide, please. All in all, these were the issues that brought into the table during the discussions. A lot of consultations took place. Many different opinions were expressed, and the final and the key topic, so to speak, whether the NIS Directive as a legislative instrument will remain as is or will change. And there are 4 options, starting from the baseline scenario where we do nothing, or until the up to the last option, which is to bring a large, an extensive number of changes to the NIS Directive. So this is from my side. Thank you, and I will be happy to contribute to the discussions.
Thank you, Konstantinos. It was very, I think, a very insightful information about, what has happened before with the NIS Directive, the work done at EU level. And also you mentioned some very interesting points of what might change actually in the Commission proposal, points that I think we will be more than eager to discuss all together during the debate time. Thank you again, and we will pass now to our second speaker for today, Paul Timmers. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Viziola, and I'm very honored to be invited here by Forum Europe to give some contribution to this debate about the NIS Directive. And what I will do is I will take a somewhat broader perspective, and I'm basing this upon a blog that I published 2 months ago about called When Sovereignty Leads and Cyber Law Follows. You can find it on directionsblog.eu. And when I'm looking at the revision of the NIS Directive, and I must say I was there at the time that it was proposed, because I was then the director in the European Commission who had responsibility for this field. At that time, the discussion was about a selected and limited number of physical and digital infrastructures that you find back in the NIS Directive. And actually even about does the Commission at the European level have a right to intervene? Isn't this all about national security? Well, or should it perhaps at most be based upon an article on emergency intervention in the treaty rather than on the internal market? Well, it ultimately did become an internal market based directive, and that national security debate has since that time, since 2013, perhaps moved a little bit to the background. But what has come up a lot is, of course, the importance of cybersecurity has really become a top topic. And also what has come up a lot is the whole debate about sovereignty and strategic autonomy, in a broad sense, no longer about defense or national security, but really about the undermining of economy and society and democracy in a wide sense. And that made me actually think about it. What are we trying to achieve with the NIS Directive? If you look at it from a sovereignty perspective, sure, we want to defend these critical infrastructures like transport, electricity, cloud services that are essential for the economy and society. But we have seen in the meantime that what got also undermined are, for example, social media, with fake news, the active undermining of democracy, the trouble that we have seen. Almost every day we hear something about intervention from Russia or China, and also other elements of our complete economic and societal and democratic infrastructure that are at risk. And so if you look at it, what is it all that needs to be protected from a sovereignty perspective of the things that we find really important for taking autonomous decisions on our own future? There's a lot more. There's a lot more than the selected physical and digital infrastructures. You see here the slide, take the left column. The selected physical and digital infrastructures are what is in the NIS Directive. And indeed, they are based upon Article 114 of the internal market, that you can do fairly strong protection there. But then telecommunications in general, that is a separate part, is in another directive. But then it becomes difficult. If we talk about social media and media protection, and we have seen that they are actively undermined, can we actually intervene from European level? And the basis for that in the treaties is relatively weak. There are other areas, industrial infrastructure based upon Internet of Things, that's essential for supply chains, not only in, let's say, production of traditional manufacturing, but even in areas like pharmaceuticals that we know are critical today. There too is a bit of a mixed basis for intervention, not really so clear that it is strong. And one of the very peculiar things is we are spending billions of euros on developing intellectual property in our research programs, but we actually don't have a common approach and strong requirements for protecting that intellectual property against cyber attacks. And it would be hard to find a strong legal basis for that. And I can go on. Let me finish with the two areas, European data spaces and education. European data spaces are really European assets. They belong to everybody in Europe. But on what basis are we going to protect those against cyber attacks? And education, if you look at the treaty, there's even not a real basis to protect it. Yet, we see it during the COVID crisis. We are super dependent upon online means, infrastructures to run our educational systems. So if I then have the next slide, that brings actually the question, we've got a bit of a mixed picture whether we can actually intervene. And intervention in the European approach comes from the treaties. So is the legal basis, as it is called, sufficient? And I think it's insufficient because of the exclusion of national security. And you quickly touch upon national security if you're going to protect certain areas of economy or democracy or society. And there was in the past a taboo to talk about sovereignty at all. So what can you do? If you take the longer term perspective, shouldn't we talk about changing the treaties or giving a direction for changing the treaties? And then in what sense? What is the kind of sovereignty that we talk about? Can we think about types of sovereignty that are perhaps rather in everybody's benefit rather than a win-lose situation between the European level and the national level? And I think we can do that. We can think, for example, about amending the Article 1 of the Treaty on the European Union by specifying that we will strengthen European sovereignty in as far as it does enhance the sovereignty of the member states. It contributes to more common European assets like these data spaces or .eu, and also strengthens the position of Europe in the world. And that's all about sovereignty, but sovereignty in a positive sense. And it's important to realize if we don't do this collaboration, we are all going to be weak. All European countries are simply too small to defend themselves on their own. And we do have real European assets like .eu or data spaces. And indeed, if we are not strong at home, we don't have a position in the world. Or said otherwise, if we are strong at home, we have a strong position in the world. But of course, this is a huge ambition to change the treaty. We might also think about smaller changes that are in individual articles, strengthening, for example, the scope of what you can deal with under the internal market, the independence of the union with respect to third countries, to add that. Or strengthen, for example, the research part of the treaty that then also would enable to protect intellectual property coming out of the European research programs. So in short, a lot has changed around the NIS Directive. We are talking about sovereignty, has a much wider scope. There's a lot more to protect. And I think we do need to think seriously about finding all the means to protect what we find essential for our future in economy, society, and democracy in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Again, a very interesting presentation. And personally, as someone following this type of topic more from the regulatory point of view, I was very pleased to see that actually there are also other very interesting ideas around the topic, like, for example, the need, as you mentioned, to make bigger changes, like changes in the treaties, to actually implement all these other bigger changes that we would like to achieve through the NIS Directive. Thank you again. Our next speaker for today will be Professor Dr. Gabriele Lenzini. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity that you gave me to attend this panel and conversations. Thank you to all the audience who are attending this talk. So I'm a professor at the University of Luxembourg and chief scientist at the Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust, with interdisciplinary center that has been established in 2009 as part of one of the national priority for strengthen, make it stronger, the research in ICT system with also a driving, let's say, a target to also stimulate the economy, the digital economy in Luxembourg. I would like to talk to open this discussion with stressing the fact that, as the NIS Directive suggested, there should be also a strong collaboration between the bodies of the governments, the industry, and the academia. So research will actually will have and is increasingly having an important role in fostering the implementation of this directive by introducing, let's say, the research that is going into the implementation of NIS. And for that, I would like to maybe illustrate a little what we do here in at the SNT, the Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust, as many other academia in Europe actually are also doing. So dedicating particular, let's say, branch of our activities to the cybersecurity. So we have here several research groups, about 15 research groups, and many of them expert in different, let's say, area of the security, reliability and trust that spread from autonomous vehicle, fintech, security and data management, compliance, space systems. But some of their activities will be now focused directly on cybersecurity, which means designing systems which are either secure or resilient or capable of, say, recovering in sufficient time to possible incident and attacks. And we do not only from the technical point of view, in the sense the traditional, let's say, security, let's say, activities of designing protocols and system and producing software which is verifiable, secure, but we also do it in an interdisciplinary way. In a sense, we are understanding that the security of system, their reliability, depends not only on the technical aspect, but also on, let's say, the environments where the system will eventually work. And those environments are social environments with people working, or organizations using the system according to their processes, but also the legal environments. So the legal ecosystem where they have to work. This one actually, at least in our university, also was taken as an opportunity to make it stronger, the interdisciplinarity aspect of the research. So now it's quite common to see more traditional, let's say, security research groups having projects in collaboration with faculties of social sciences, faculties of law, and with the industrial partners. That's also, so the collaboration with the industrial partners is also another, let's say, the third pillars of how academia is trying to moving forward to the implementation of NIS, or contributing to it. And at least in our research centers, this has been concretized or operationalized in a specific partnership programs where companies can work together with the research groups to develop a common research program where the research will be bridged into the real world through the to industrial partners, and together we'd also assess or evaluate or study emerging problem that maybe the industry themselves might not have the resources of the time and the focus to address, while the academia might bring their its added value. So for me, what I would like to at least to bring to the contribution to the discussion today is indeed this contribution that the academia is bringing into the implementation of the directive through these three pillars. Let's see, dedicated cybersecurity resources and focus, collaborations between different disciplines within the academia, but also collaboration between academia and industry, the industry and the government bodies outside. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Lentini, thank you for giving us an overview of the Luxembourg Center. And as you mentioned, it is very important that all stakeholders, take part in such topics like the NIS Directive. And of course, academia has a very central role in providing us the necessary information to create such pieces of legislation. Thank you again, Professor. We will head now to the other speaker for today's session, Tanya Wallace. Tanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name's Tanya Wallace from University of Glasgow. Thank you for inviting me to the cybersecurity salon today. I'm going to talk to you about my perspective. I've actually been researching the operators of essential services and their experiences with implementing the NIS directive. I've been looking in particular at the energy sector, water sector, and transport as well, and just learning about their experiences so far with implementing NIS. So I would say that it's given them a really strong focus to improve their cybersecurity levels. It's very much raised awareness right across their organisations. When they've had to identify the scope of NIS within their own organisation and to look at their own critical assets and what's critical for the essential service that they offer, it's enabled interactions around cybersecurity across different departments, and as I say, has really raised awareness in a more broad way. With the legal duty of the NIS directive being upon them, it's really helped them to achieve support at the board levels as well. So that rather than just their internal cybersecurity teams asking for changes and improvements, it's coming from a higher level. So those are some of the strengths and successes that I've been observing. But in terms of the OES having the duty upon them to improve cybersecurity for their essential service, they've been needing to look at managing all their supplier relationships. There's many levels to what they're offering, and different organisations they're working with, different products and services that they've taken on, and they're needing to look at cybersecurity across all of those. And there's very much different levels to that. So what they have control of within their own organisation, as well as where they're needing to look for more collaboration with other organisations to progress improved cybersecurity across the products and services they use. So it's really been about the OES themselves, as well as the other organisations they work with, and the products and services that they employ, to all of those to really know their role in critical infrastructure and what their place and responsibility is in the supply chain. So it's led them towards really needing to be more coherent and consistent in how they work with their suppliers, and begin to work together as OES to offer a clearer strategy for their vendors to meet, in a clearer direction on what their requirements actually are. So to comment on the identification of operators of essential services, and there being differences across different nations, I think there's been situations where smaller organisations that maybe haven't been identified, it's important to consider their impact. So a small organisation could be having a big impact if their service is lost. I think there have also been big organisations that have been identified as OES, but maybe only a small department is partially involved in an essential service, but the whole organisation then is getting treated as an OES, where assistance is being made available to OES. So I would say that NIS is very much introducing a culture of risk management, and each nation needs to sort of understand more their dependency on critical infrastructure, and that it being perhaps there being a risk decision for each nation state in terms of what their nation's threat level is, the resilience level they already have with their existing infrastructure, and the extent to which they need to apply NIS to the organisations involved in that infrastructure. So I would say there needs to be more of an outcome-based identification of the operators. So to look at, have they adequately covered their essential services with their NIS regulations, and have they looked at potential cross-border impacts, and has that also been considered in how they've identified their operators of essential services? And to talk to the issue of incident notification processes, should we be having a similar thresholds for OES that we have for the digital service providers? What I would say to that is the digital service providers, their incidents are obviously for digital services, so they're always going to be NIS related, whereas the operators of essential services, their reporting of service outages is very much entangled with other incidents related to perhaps electricity supply or water supply. So the operators are accustomed to reporting their crisis events that are also unrelated to IT. So, for example, the customer minutes lost due to a power outage, weather incidents are affecting their infrastructure. Whereas the reporting under NIS is to do with a network and information system failure or a NIS compromise, as well as the impact on their essential service, whether that's water supply, electricity supply, and so on. So the reporting of cyber incidents that significantly affect a continuity of their essential service. So a number of cybersecurity incidents may not actually have the knock-on effect of causing a power outage or an effect to their essential service. So it has been encouraged, some more voluntary reporting has been encouraged in order for the competent authorities to start to understand the pattern of activity and what the latest threat picture is. So as well as the mandatory reporting, the trusted relations between the different organisations involved in this is really important to really understand how vulnerabilities in different equipment are being exploited, and to help the operators have a better, clearer picture of the latest threat landscape so they can make better preparations. So I would emphasize the importance of collaborations between the different organizations involved in this, and the importance of ISACs and voluntary sharing to assist each other, because it's not something OES can do on their own. The NIS Directive uses the operators of essential services as a focal point, which has been really, really important to get this started. But yet there needs to be support for the collaborations required for organisations to work together. And in terms of interactions between different regulations, so we have NIS and GDPR that very much complement each other. We have security requirements for telecoms infrastructure, and also the digital service providers, including cloud services. So what I would point out is even with the certification of products, or with the telecom securities for core telecoms infrastructure, there's still the need to look at an operator's deployment of all these things, and that there's a collaboration between the OT spaces, the IT, and how that's integrating, and also their increasing use of cloud service providers, their use of data centers, and to really start to understand the dependencies across different infrastructures in order to continue to provide their service. And what visibility they have of cybersecurity configurations in each of those infrastructures and of their cloud assets and so on. So again, while there are different regulations helping each of those infrastructures do the right thing, the operator still has to look at how they've plugged it all together in their own particular deployment, and what the configuration is and the risks are for their particular implementation of their service. So in terms of widening the scope of NIS, I would say that dependency on data centers is quite important, and also to think about the increasing use of cloud services and some OT functions starting to happen in the cloud as well. So we need to look at, as we go forward, the changes in technology, how the operation of our essential services is changing and evolving, and therefore what infrastructures become more important and that we're more dependent upon going forward, and to adjust how we're doing things as a result of that. And also with the COVID situation, that has perhaps changed how we're interacting with OT environments and with our how the interaction with managing essential services has changed, and potentially that is changing the dependencies on different applications and so on. So yeah, thank you for that, and yeah, I look forward to.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you very much for giving us a bit, the practical side of the coin when it comes to the implementation of the NIS for different sectors. You also mentioned something very important, I think, that the NIS directive indeed brought up a culture of risk management for many sectors that are, vital to our economy, as well as you mentioned some very interesting points for discussion that, yes, I'm sure we'll have the time to debate them also with the other speakers. Thank you again, Tanya.
Thank you.
Now to our last speaker for today, last but not least, Dr. Richard Thomas. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you to Forum Europe for inviting me to speak in this panel today. My name is Richard Thomas. I'm an industrial fellow in data integration and cybersecurity at the University of Birmingham, and I lead our rail cybersecurity practice within the Ukraine Centre of Excellence in Digital Systems. For the last 4 years, I've been looking at how industrial security, especially in critical national infrastructure, really matters to the nation. And this really is a positive thing. It's actually driven the culture of security across many sectors. It actually is really good for recognition that security matters as well as safety. And what we've actually seen is NIS has been in force obviously since 2018, and we now can take the time to reflect over the last 2 years and see where support is needed. So the work I've been looking at is particularly in how we support asset owners in implementing and meeting the requirements of the NIS directive based on what their member states are and the competent authorities are requiring. And obviously, the sectors we currently have identified within the operators of essential services within this directive, you have a big problem of it's a very different ecosystem to traditional IT. So how do you go and assure the security of your systems, your networks and your infrastructures appropriately? We can't simply apply, say, a typical pen test scanner and apply it to our operational systems because they may react very differently. I used to say that the NIS directive was a beating stick to try and encourage security. But actually what I've now seen over the last 2 years is it's been a very good conversation starter. It's allowed operators to work out what they've got how it plays towards their essential service, and pose hypothetical questions. For example, if this particular box was targeted, what else could happen? So they're talking about what in the rail sector we call reasonably foreseeable instances. And it's quite positive that the asset owner, whilst they have this requirement that they have to assure the security of their infrastructures, you take your supply chain certification, but you must prove it yourself on top. It's prompting these good conversations between asset owners and the supply chain, and understanding what your supply chain is, how far it goes up, and also what can they do to set a trajectory going forward to improve the security of your systems. Now, one of the interesting things within the NIS Directive is it is designed to not be prescriptive. So it's reliant on the member states defining what their OESs are. And we've seen some disparity across member states. So, for example, until recently, in one member state in the EU, the rail sector wasn't actually deemed an essential service. It now is in scope, but it's interesting to see what the member states chose as their essential services and why. And also, what do you have to do to comply with the NIS Directive? I use comply very lightly. So in the UK, we have the reporting thresholds, which we're now looking at trying to revise, because we see that there's more opportunity for this conversation happening. If we reduce the thresholds a little bit to say, we almost hit it, why did it happen? And also try and prompt cross-sector solutions. What's interesting also about the NIS Directive is it's driven a conversation across industry. So in the rail sector, we've actually been talking outside of our individual organizations, and there's actually talks of a technical standard that's quite mature now. There's actually draft text being written to say, we recognize as a rail sector, being especially given the high level of interoperability and intercompatibility, that we can actually drive as a sector a baseline forward. So that is a technical standard designed just for security that says, you are a rolling stock manufacturer, you make trains, you make a signaling system, you are part of the railway ecosystem. Here is some tooling, here's some advice, here's some guidance that lets you upskill and improve the security overall. And we will continuously review this. So we drive as a sector changes forward. And we've seen that inside of rail. So energy particularly is a good example. Part of my work is also in supporting asset owners in the tooling and how they go about asking these questions of the supply chain. So as I said, traditional IT people have been put under the scope of an OES for this. So they have to understand what the operational technology works, the things that move pistons, that change sensors, that take the sensor readings, do something. So it's helping them understand this different world. And what are the key questions you should be asking of your vendor? So in traditional IT, we worry about confidentiality more than anything. In OT, the things that are under scope of CNI and the operators of essential services, it's all about availability. So how do we foster those conversations? And we've been looking at threat landscapes and saying, just for OES, this is what you should start talking to your supply chain about. And likewise for the supply chain, what are the priorities they should be trying to address for their customers so we can increase that baseline going forward. One interesting final comment I've got about the NIS Directive is that also obviously being 2 years on, it means that we can look at all the member states and see what guidance they've produced. And perhaps there is some universal guidance that could be published to help those who are struggling on their NIS journeys, to where there may be a lack of maturity, and trying to understand what that reason is. And just saying, in some member states, they've done this and it's working quite well. Let's share those good practices all around. So I look forward to any questions you raise, and look forward to being part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Richard Thomas. Again, a very interesting presentation on your side. Again, mentioning a bit, on the practical side of the implementation and aspects of the NIS Directive, as well as things that maybe we could see to change in the future. Thank you again. I would like to thank again all the speakers. They all had like very interesting and different presentations at the same time. It shows, I think, the variety of our discussion that is coming soon, and also many different aspects that maybe might need to be revised and might need to be changed in the NIS directive, in the current NIS regime. And I would like to start with a question, I think a very burning question that we have seen also, recently, dealing really with the scope of the directive. We know that like the scope of the directive focuses on operators of essential services, digital service providers, but do we need actually within these operators of essential services and digital service providers to even extend further, the scope of the directive? And in particular, a question that comes also from the audience, and if one of you could address it during the debate, has to do with the fact if cloud providers should be classified as essential service providers. So any one of you would like to start? Maybe Professor Lentini, I think you are a fan of this question.
Yes, I can discuss about whether to extend the pool of services and operators that goes in certain classifications. So at least considering the cloud operators from digital service provider to operator of essential services, actually could make sense, even though I think that, however, the two classification of even leaving the cloud provider as a digital service providers category, it's actually working pretty well, in the sense they have even stricter thresholds in terms of reporting incident, in terms of implementation of standards. So I would not see a benefit of just moving from one category to another. Maybe what I would probably consider more essential is maybe extending the terms of thresholds and even recommendations that the two categories, could implement. For example, maybe linking to what Costantino said before, that we should maybe consider open up the possibility to indicating as digital services also the social media or the education systems, or the massive online courses that we see that we are using together. That may call for example, different requirements beyond the traditional CIA, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability plus authentication. For example, it may be suggesting that also properties like verifiability and auditability should become mandatory. And these are to, giving the possibility to the auditors of even anyone to verify whether something is providing the security, the confidentiality, and all the properties that they claim to be. And this also becomes even more important whenever we have solutions that relies on artificial intelligence, and now is, booming in terms of research. So giving the possibility to audit or verify what happens, that is also an instrument that actually will be making possible to bring a certain software solution in court and verify actually what happens. If you think about the voting system, for example, the verifiability becomes an essential property for the general reliability of the system, because actually you can see whether something has happened or not. So just to give the takeaway of the answer, more than just moving, entities from one category to another, I would consider more important to extend the requirements and the threshold for the categories themselves in such a way to be more representative of the reality of systems and operators that we have today. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Lentini. Paul, maybe you would like to go next. Based on your blog article I read a few days ago, I think you had quite some suggestions on extending the scope of the NIS directive.
Yeah, if I take up on that particular question about cloud providers and should they be classified as operators of essential services, I would rather say, and here I think I'm with Gabriele also, that the harmonized approach that we have for the digital service provider should be applied to the operators of essential services, because one of the difficulties is, of course, that and that comes back to that blog and the debate about national security. You know, if you think that there is national security, you will want to essentially determine the requirements at national level, and that leads to fragmentation, which is immediately in conflict with the internal market. So there's a real lack of logic, I think, that risks to be entered if you don't take a harmonized approach. And of course, the digital service providers are anyway across all of the internal markets, so the harmonized approach was natural for the digital service providers and was considered not to be natural for, say, a rail operator. But as Richard also said, you know, take the area of energy. We've got end-to-end energy policy. That's actually also a harmonized area. So any of these areas that we are talking about are essentially about providing facilities that are not only essential services within your country, but that are also interconnected to the rest of Europe, and increasingly are under common European policies, rail transport policies, common policy, energy, electricity, and that's why you see also the electricity directives have taken up massively on cybersecurity and harmonized approaches. Financial, we have already seen. Financial thought already they were essentially in a harmonized system and had their own good requirements, so they demanded a lex specialis approach. And I bet you that if we are going to go into things like data spaces, industrial, environmental, health data spaces, they are also Europe-wide. And so they are also considered to be natural candidates for harmonized approaches. And that brings it then back to it, you know, what actually is there that is not really suitable for a European approach? And I would contend that even education, which is very national, should have a European approach for the underlying digital platforms and the approaches that we take to these platforms, because actually the operators are Europe-wide. Zoom, which by the way is a non-European provider, is operating all across the world, and this also holds for other platforms. So that's, I think, a key point to consider. There is actually much more Europe that gets introduced by this thinking about a revision of the NIS Directive than we may ever have thought.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I think I would like to go next with Tanya on the question. Tanya, your remarks on extending the scope on maybe cloud providers classified as operators of essential services.
Yeah, I would say it's important to look at what is essential for the reliability of our services. So with each OES looking at their own scope of critical assets and how they deploy their and how they provide their essential service. With the picture of that, as cloud providers become more important and more, it's important to look at the dependencies of our services. So, like as cloud providers become more and more important, I think they need to be given more weight in the discussion, for sure.
I think there was a broadband disconnection on my side. Tanya, you are done, I think, with your answer?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, my apologies, there was a disconnection. Richard, would you like to comment on the question?
Yes, so cloud service providers are somewhat of an interesting being. So at least from the conversations I've been having with people within the rail sector and other industrial sectors that are OESs in the UK, they have actually been reaching out to cloud service providers. So they've said, we host some of our systems on your infrastructure. So in the UK, we have an implementation of the NIS Directive in the form of the Cyber Assessment Framework, which is all ICAM focused. And it's all about you essentially proving that you meet the certain requirements that are aligned to the NIS Directive. And what we've been seeing is, as you explore what bits of equipment and services that make up your essential service, you have been going up the supply chain, and some people have been going to where physical pieces of tin live, the spinning discs, and saying, you now are technically part of my NIS journey. Can you please answer this questionnaire that has been given to me by my competent authority as a third-party supplier? And that's actually fostered quite some interesting conversations, particularly around, I'm a cloud service provider, you are an OES, but I also have a lot of other customers to worry about. And it's around how do you do this upskilling and baselining, and making sure that you don't become a special customer of that cloud service.
I understand. Thank you, Richard. And I think I left Konstantinos for the end because I was quite curious to see what. There was another disconnection. Apologies. Konstantinos, I think I left you on purpose for the end because as a representative of ENISA, I was a bit curious, maybe after hearing all this answer, you might give us a bit an idea of what's behind the legislative proposal when it comes to extending the scope of the directive.
I think this question might be for the next revision, not this one. Because first we have problems to identify what is a cloud provider. So we are at this stage at the moment. Member states have difficulties to identify what is the cloud provider. So and ENISA has worked a lot together with the member states in the context of the NIS cooperation group to identify and promote a decision tree, which is not yet fully agreed to speak. We are trying to do pilots, with the member states in order to decide what is a cloud provider. So the question, I would say, it's quite, so to speak, not premature. I understand the point, fully understand that, cloud providers, essential service providers depend on cloud providers. So an operator who is critical has to depend and follows stricter security practices, has to depend on an entity which follows a lighter approach, so to speak. This is an issue to see how it will solve, if it will be solved in the next, in the coming revision. However, as I said before, we have first to solve the problem of what is a cloud provider.
Thank you, Konstantinos. And I would like to stay a second with you because I have quite an interesting question from the audience referring a bit to the new European cybersecurity competence centers that will be established as of 2021. I think it will start to be active. When will be operational the new competence center established in Bucharest, and especially how is seen its role in implementing the NIS directive? Meaning, will this center have a role when it comes to the NIS directive? Based on my understanding, I know it will help a bit with the EU Cybersecurity Act and the certification. But yeah, on the NIS, maybe you could comment on it.
Yes, as I said before, the existing version of the NIS directive has actually no the private sector element is missing from the current version of the NIS directive. I don't know if it would be there for the next one. The same applies for the research. So there is no connection at the current version between the NIS directive and the research and in the private sector. As per the national competence center, so to speak, the way I see the connection might be through the national cybersecurity strategies, where every member state has the freedom, the sovereignty to decide how to connect, critical infrastructures with research and so on and so forth. At the level of EU, at the moment, there is no such a connection between these two instruments. and let's see if will be for the review for the next version of the NIS Directive.
Thank you. Thank you, Konstantinos. Another question that it's a bit burning to me is it relates actually to security requirements. So the NIS Directive indeed has 2 articles when it comes to the security measures that operators of essential services and digital service providers need to take, appropriate and technical measures to mitigate the risk presented. But would you be in favor of probably introducing in the NIS Directive a sort of baseline security, so a minimum set of security, more explicit security requirements that member states have to take? Because I remember from the Commission report of 2019, the report where, the Commission noted some segmentation when it came to identifying operators of essential services. One thing that was mentioned was also that member states have different level of preparedness when it comes to, handling security breaches. So would you be in favor of actually more specific security requirements? Of course, a minimum baseline to be introduced in the NIS Directive. Anyone that would like to go first?
Perhaps I would. Paul, please.
Well, perhaps just a comment about it. Let's imagine these minimum security requirements to be really in place. And we actually have an example of that, isn't it? The 5G security recommendation. And
yes,
in the 5G security recommendation, we have not only these criteria that are technical criteria, but we also have other criteria like the reliability of the supplier and whether there's any kind of due justice system, accountable system behind the supplier in its country of origin. And there are doubts, of course, about that. That's why the whole discussion came up on 5G security. So I think that the answer would be for the NIS Directive, yes, you will have technical criteria, but there must also be these other criteria that have to do more with the reliability of your supplier, perhaps from whatever you would like to call it, the trustworthiness of the supplier. And that goes back to the aspect which is very hard to capture in the NIS Directive. So there are 2 problems in the that you see in the NIS Directive, and I would like to also see what Richard thinks about it from the OT perspective. Say the general kind of risks that we are talking about are these disturbances, that can be quite damaging, but they are not so damaging that they bring your country to a standstill. So that's one risk that is imagined. There might be in cyber Armageddon at some moment in time, and the country comes to a standstill. Can you defend yourself against that in the NIS Directive? Second risk is the constant erosion of your sovereignty, so that there is a constant undermining below the level of war, essentially, type of disruption that can damage your economic effectiveness, that can leak intellectual property, etc. So this constant erosion. So the question would be, with the risk management approach and even with the minimum requirements approach, do we also cover these 2 extremes? And I doubt that we will.
Thank you, Paul. Konstantinos, maybe you were willing to also comment on this?
The fact is that there are some security requirements, but are not non-binding. This is the issue, because the NIS Cooperation Group has adopted the document as per the horizontal security measures for all sectors. And this document is non-binding, of course. It's a guideline to the member states. Now, if it's a good idea to adopt binding security measures, adopting a baseline creates the following issue. The operators comply with the minimum and don't invest more on cybersecurity. So this is a kind of the false sense of security, so to speak. So apart from this, as Tanya said, each member state is doing its own risk assessment, and there are differences in the level of risk for each member state. This goes together with sovereignty, with what Paul said. So it's difficult to have a common security baseline, and at the same time trigger and encourage the operators to invest more on cybersecurity. If we, in the next version, a common security requirement is adopted, then for sure it has to be accompanied with provisions which stimulate investments and continuous improvement in cybersecurity.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Yes, Professor Lentini.
I wanted to add something about, let's say, in addition to the maybe revisions of requirements, security requirements. I think his argument was also in one of the NISA report that I read recently. The fact that we might also need to specify a bit better what we mean with incident or adversary effect or substantial impact, because maybe not so uniform the way we interpret it, and especially when we think about this, let's say, erosion, which is a slow effect that maybe eventually will sum up to something like talking again about the social media fake news, the disruption in the trust in society. It will not happen definitely as a substantial impact once in a certain moment. It's something that you evaluate in the long run. And this, I think, is probably in the NIS directive is left, let's say, quite vague. And what an incident is, what an adversary effect is, what a substantial impact is. While I think now that we have a bit more even example of how the say the digital society can be attacked, okay, would be useful to have a bit more say revised definition of those concepts. Thanks. I finished. Maybe there is a...
Thank you, Professor. Maybe someone else would like also to comment? Tanya, Richard?
Yes, I would add to that the experiences of operators in dealing with...
Tot maandag normaal. Tot de volgende keer, dan zijn we zeker.
Sorry. I would add to that the experiences of operators in dealing with their own supply chains, and they're facing the situation of, you know, what can they expect, what security requirements can they expect to be offered as standard and included, and what should they be paying extra for. So there is a need at that end of things to start to specify what a baseline would be. But yes, I understand there's also a risk with setting a baseline that that's all you get, and you don't get any more than that. But also operators are in some areas encouraged to use small to medium enterprises, and so smaller organizations may have fewer resources to meet security requirements. So there does need to be some kind of hand-holding amongst different levels of capability. I don't know what that would be, but some kind of clusters of support from larger organizations with higher capability, assisting the upskilling of smaller organizations with lower capability, so that at least the baseline can be achieved, but with encouragement for more as well.
Thank you, Tanya. Richard, would you like to add any comment to what the speakers already mentioned?
Yes, so Paul was talking about resilience, and I think that is something that we have implemented in that reporting threshold. So within the member state implementations, it's essentially how much impact to that essential service can we absorb before there is a visible impact. Now, in terms of increased setting a baseline, there are arguments for and against. So it's a catch-22 situation. You can, like Paul, Konstantinos, and everyone on the panel has said, there is a cost-benefit analysis you've got to do of the baseline. So you set it, it's fantastic because it means there is a motivation across many sectors to improve the security and have a set minimum. But as everyone said, there won't be much incentive to go above and beyond. And maybe it's about flipping that conversation around to say, as you're developing new products, as we've seen in the design stage, putting in that over and above is going to be a lot cheaper in the long run. And whether it's for existing systems, use that as your baseline, but you should aim above and beyond, because when we, using a ratchet analogy, when we do that next notch on the ratchet, it's going to be a lot cheaper and you're already prepared for, to adopt it.
My apologies again. There was I was disconnected from my broadband connection, so I missed Fiola's point. Richard, I suppose you mentioned what you wanted to say, although unfortunately I didn't hear it.
I did. It was about designing in security early, because it's cheaper to the supply chain and it's more attractive, and it means that we can prepare for those incremental baselines going forward.
Okay, thank you. I think I have another question that was addressed to Paul. Just let me find it. Yeah, Paul, this question is specifically for you. How does sovereignty hold itself to global social media like Facebook? They have own set of rules. How can we help adhere to our own sovereignty rules?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that social media are essential for democracy, education, even economic affairs. But that's not all necessarily cybersecurity, but it's important for sovereignty, because that all has to function. So you have to look at social media from a sovereignty perspective, and this may mean, for example, that if you don't have enough say over a few large social media providers, you may actually want to intervene by means of legislation. And who knows, perhaps that's going to happen under the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act. But there is the cybersecurity specific element of it, which we are looking at here for social media, and that must have to do with the CIA of cybersecurity: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we have seen that also at the side of confidentiality, there's trouble with social media. You know, not too long ago, there was someone who had broken into the accounts and was spoofing the accounts of, of Obama and a number of other celebrities. There, likewise, you may want to impose that's a breach of confidentiality. And there's also manipulation of the information. So there's a breach of integrity. Availability, a little bit less, but we have seen a few incidents there. But they are now so important that from that perspective too, you may want to intervene on it. And I think, as a matter of fact, there is a fair chance that could be done without necessarily the social media operators being so troublesome about it. They are much more troublesome if it is about controlling the content and what is being done with the content and the data. That's not, I think, necessarily part of cybersecurity. Needs to be also dealt with. But from a cybersecurity perspective, I can imagine that there's a reasonable set of requirements that can be put on the table for the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity and availability of social media. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Any of the speakers would like maybe to add something on this question that seemed really targeted for Paul?
Yes, maybe not specifically to the.
Yes, Professor Lentini.
Yes. So now maybe not specifically to the jurisdiction, which probably I think there is an article in the NIS that talks about the jurisdiction of services that might not have, let's say, a headquarters in Europe, and they should have a representative, however, so that they become legally, let's say, accountable. But in terms, yes, of what we can enforce, is definitely, as Paul said, there are interesting, say, aspects, but not only about integrity of the data, the confidentiality, but as I said before, also something new. So actually the disruption of the social media is something for me very peculiar to be captured, because you might have an effect even beyond stealing identity of users and changing information so that where integrity comes from. You can fabricate, for example, in news, okay, out of nothing, and they are integral in this sense. Nobody modified, just they're made up. But this one comes out to the verifiability. So actually, many newspapers actually are implementing now this possibility of verifying the source of and the history of a piece of news, so that properties like fabricated news or with no origin at all can be verified. So actually, what I'm saying, so the takeaway is that beyond the jurisdiction for which maybe read an article deciding what is the jurisdiction of the social media, it might be interesting also to discuss with them or enforce them certain properties they might be able to capture specific attacks that today remains behind the lines in the shadow. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Lentini. And I think it's time for us to wrap up this session. I would like to thank again all the speakers for all their key messages, the fact that the NIS Directive has done quite a good job and that more has to come. I guess we're all looking forward to the Commission proposal, so a lot of pressure on the EU institution side. Again, a record of this session will be available on Forum Europe YouTube channel. And thank you again for being with us here today. And stay tuned with Forum Europe for future events. Thank you.
Thank you to our moderators and the organizers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.